Hey, I'm Kiiru Gichuru, and welcome to Let It Rip. We're coming to you from the CUNY TV studios in the shadow of the Empire State Building in New York City. Earlier this summer, the United States Supreme Court ruled that colleges and universities could no longer use race in the admissions process. The lawsuit to end affirmative action was brought by an organization called the Students for Fair Admissions, which alleged that Harvard University and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill were discriminating against Asian American applicants through their use of a race-conscious admissions process. The lawsuit was funded by Edward Blum, a white conservative activist who has been on a long crusade to end affirmative action in higher education. In fact, Blum was also responsible for funding the litigation to gut the Voting Rights Act that led some states to enact voter suppression laws, all which disproportionately affect the poor, the elderly, and black voters. Now, here to help us discuss the Supreme Court's decision and its effects on the future of college admissions and employment is Margaret Chin, a professor of sociology at CUNY's Hunter College, and George White, the dean at CUNY's York College. I'm Kiiru Gichuru, and this is Let It Rip. Welcome. Margaret, let's start with you. One of the questions that people have is with regard to Edward Blum, who, in addition to gutting the Voting Rights Act, has now also been successful in getting the Supreme Court to ban affirmative action. Some people argue that he's taking us back to the Jim Crow era, and that using Asian Americans is essentially driving a wedge between Asian Americans and African Americans. I'm curious as to what you would say with regard to that.
I'd have to say to you that I think you're absolutely right. Thank you. First, I want to say thank you for having me on the show today, Kiiru. I really appreciate the chance to speak up about this case. And first of all, yeah, Edward Blum is not a friend of Asian Americans, because I think that he, for the most part, has really used Asian Americans to drive that wedge between the different groups. Asian Americans have benefited from affirmative action all the way through, ever since the very beginning. Asian Americans at Harvard, from the data from the case, and I'm a Harvard alum myself. I actually went to school there in the fall of 1980. So in the fall of 1980, there were only 5% Asian Americans on campus. And up till now, this last year, they're almost close to 30% of the campus, of the incoming freshman class. So Asian Americans have definitely benefited. And one of the reasons Edward Blum tries to reinforce is the stereotype of the model minority. He believes that Asian Americans are all the wealthy, do good, do great on all the tests. But in fact, that kind of stereotype actually is not what Asian Americans are all about. Asian Americans are a really broad racial group in the United States. They have the largest wealth gap out of every single racial group in the United States. They're also made up of over 20 ethnic groups, over more than 20 languages. Thus, you have Asian Americans somewhere who may not even think about affirmative action, but you have lots of Asian Americans who actually would benefit from it as well.
George, let's come to you. I want to go back to the initial case about affirmative action, and that's the Bakke v. California.
Yes.
One of the things that Justice Marshall and the dissenting colleagues were saying that affirmative action should essentially be used as a remediation of past discrimination. But somehow Justice Powell, in his majority decision, was able to delink the remediation aspect of it and say you should use it as a diversity tool. Right. What do you think about that?
Clearly, the decision in Bakke was kind of the first strike at kind of trying to attack a remedy for past as well as ongoing discrimination. And we've seen the court do this over time, including its interpretation that to demonstrate or prove racial discrimination, one has to prove intent. Right. And what we now know with unconscious bias and implicit discrimination, that proving intent can also almost be impossible. So the court definitely kind of was moving away from any real efforts from Bakke. And one of the things to kind of underscore part of what Margaret said is that the attack that Blum is making is based on three very flawed assumptions. One of which is that Black and brown and immigrant students are inherently unqualified because they never challenged in the Bakke case the dozens of white students who had lower SATs, MCAT and grades than Bakke himself. And in the same way here, through the litigation, there's no testimony from the Asian Americans who are essentially kind of propped up to be the front for Ed Blum.
Right. And so what does that say about Blum's repeated attempts to get to, what is this finally court decision?
Yeah.
But that he had actually tried this before with a white woman, Amy Fisher. He was unsuccessful there.
Right.
What does that tell us in terms of the trajectory for what affirmative action was going to be or not to be?
Right. I think what it tells us is the desperation of the opponents of affirmative action, that they're willing to do anything possible. And so one of those things, again, as you put it, was potentially to drive a wedge between two very, incredibly impacted communities in this country. Because when I look at the litigation and I look at what Blum was not able to accomplish. So he recruited or tried to recruit hundreds of Asian American families, and they all said no. And so the fact that he's only got 6 and they can't even speak, to me speaks to the solidarity of the Asian American community with Black and brown communities, and the fact that he does not take this seriously. He's not focused on this at all. This is aimed at a retrenchment or a retraction of progress in America over the last half century.
Margaret, I'd like to come back to you. One of the arguments, and I think George touched on this a little bit, was this idea of minority equivalence, right? That you sort of juxtapose Asian Americans and African Americans and make the argument that, using that old stereotype of modern minority, that through hard work, that you'd be able to overcome any racial discrimination barriers. What would you say to that?
I would say that's the stereotype that people use. And I think with this law case, what he was doing was that he was trying to reinforce that stereotype. Asian Americans are really diverse. There are only, these Ivy League plus colleges. The majority of Asian Americans don't go to these colleges. They go to CUNY, they go to every place in the world, especially public colleges across the United States. In New York City, the majority of them attend public schools, and not Stuyvesant, not Brooklyn Tech, not Brown Science, in fact. So what he's trying to do is reinforce this particular stereotype and use it against, guess what, ourselves and against all the other groups, to divide and conquer and use it as a wedge. Even for these elite schools, for all the students who apply, there are thousands of students who score perfect scores on the SATs, perfect GPAs, more than enough, more that they can actually accommodate at Harvard, is what they showed in the case. And during this whole process of these last few years with this particular case, many people equate affirmative action with quotas and different, which it isn't, right? And so I think the message that the media and different people, especially SFFA, has portrayed is not accurate. And I think we don't want to be pawns. There are so many of us, including me, who've benefited from affirmative action. Tons of us who really believe that we wouldn't be where we were where we are actually without affirmative action.
All right. Thank you, Margaret. George, I'd like to come to you with regard to something that you said earlier. This idea that there have always been alliances between Asian Americans. I mean, we can go back to the Civil Rights era where SNCC, Muhammad Ali, Martin Luther King came out very strongly against the Vietnam War. And even internationally, we can think of the 1955 Bandung Conference where there was some collaboration between Asian countries and newly independent African states. What does this case say about that level of collaboration going forward?
It encourages us to return to that, a very active engagement with across these communities, because I think the divides that keep us apart are largely either hype or propaganda, much like what Ed Blum is doing, or simple misunderstandings, where we have this legacy of people like Richard Aoki or Fred Ho being involved with Black Power struggles, whether it's the Panthers or other groups. And we see this across the country with Yuri Kochiyama and Malcolm X here in New York. this kind of solidarity has always been there. And so I think it's a call to action in a way for us to return to those roots.
Oh, fantastic. So is your sense that we have to make greater efforts towards greater collaboration with Asian Americans and Black folks?
Yeah, I think so. And I also think that we need to expose a lot of the flawed assumptions that underline both the argumentation from Ed Blum, but the reasoning of Chief Justice Roberts. One of those things is around the SATs and standardized tests themselves. So when I teach my classes at York, I will tell the students that the standardized tests are not tests of intelligence.
Right.
They're not.
Right.
So, and I'll use myself as an example. I said when I was in college, I was a history major and I wanted to go to law school, and I took an LSAT cold, got a score, it was okay, but not what I wanted.
Right.
I was driving a cab my junior and senior year, so whenever I queue up at a hotel or at the airport, I could take my books with me.
Oh,
so
okay.
I studied and I took tests and I studied and I took practice tests, and every time I took a test after studying, the higher the score was.
Right.
And ultimately I scored high enough that I was accepted to Harvard Law School. And I tell my students that demonstrates that the standardized test is not a test of intelligence. Otherwise, my score would never have changed.
Okay. It's a great answer. And I know a lot of your college students also work, in addition to coming to school. So great.
Yeah.
Margaret, I'd like to get your comment on that, and we'll come to you for the last comment.
Sure. So I was going to say that, it's absolutely right. I was going to say you can even go further back in history. Frederick Douglass actually was against the Chinese exclusion laws.
Yes.
He really believed in immigration and how important it was for Chinese immigrants to come here and to let them become citizens as well. Right. Just like Black Americans became citizens after the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, right? So it's a long history that we actually have solidarity. And I completely agree. If you look at the photos from the Supreme Court arguments, you see all the young people. You see a multiracial coalition. You see this building of young people for a multiracial democracy. And you even see that on the Harvard campus right after the decision came out. Right. So those are the photos you need to look at. And you can see that young people know this is not what's going on.
Okay. Thank you so much, Margaret. That's been a great discussion. It remains quite clear that the Supreme Court's decision was wrong and sets us on a path that fails to address the continuing negative impact of racism. I want to thank our guests, Margaret Chin and George White. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, we'll take a look at the fate of legacy admissions in New York State. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was great.
With the Supreme Court failing to address legacy admissions as a form of affirmative action that favors mostly white applicants, there's been an increasing backlash against legacy admissions. State legislatures across the country, including Connecticut and Massachusetts, are considering banning legacy admissions. Here in New York, the state legislature recently introduced a bill, the Fair College Admissions Act, that would end the use of legacy admissions in colleges and universities. At the municipal level, the New York City Council voted overwhelmingly to pass a resolution sponsored by Council Member Eric Dinowitz, encouraging the state legislature to pass the Fair College Admissions Act. Now, here to help us discuss the end of legacy admissions is New York State Assembly Member Latrice Walker and the New York City Council Member Eric Dinowitz. Let's start with you, Assembly Member. Tell us a little bit about the new bill ending legacy admissions, or at least proposing to end legacy admissions in New York State.
Well, I will say that there was a saying that education is the great equalizer. But unfortunately, access to that education has not been equal. And we saw in the recent dismantling of affirmative action in our country that opportunities which were presented to all Americans who wanted to avail themselves of higher education were knocked down. However, there is still another legacy that exists here in New York, where race-based, privilege-based opportunities to attend some of the most prestigious universities and colleges in our state are still available. And so we want education and our policies to be utilized as a shield and not a sword. And so we believe that since there's been an eradication of affirmative action in our country, that it has to be across the board. And so any race-based decision-making should no longer exist. It should have a total ban. And we need to enhance opportunities and not privilege, particularly for those who are already privileged.
Eric, let me come to you. What's your take on race-based and college admissions process? We'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, the council overwhelmingly passed this resolution in support of that bill to ban legacy admissions. I was a public school special education teacher here in the city for over 13 years, and I think the way the assembly member described it is absolutely right. Education is the great equalizer. And I saw so many of my students who are definitely smarter than I was when I was in high school, but weren't provided all the opportunities that were available to me. Okay. And we need to make sure that those opportunities continue to be available for them. But when we have legacy admissions, it in fact takes opportunities excuse me, away from the students who are working extremely hard and show extreme promise, but again, don't have the same path to college as those with legacy-based admissions who are automatically getting the equivalent of 160 points more on their SAT scores.
Right. Assembly Member, I'd like to come back to you, particularly with regard to your bill. One of the things that people have been pushing back on with regards to legacy admissions is that it allows alumni to force a deeper relationship with the institution that they graduated from. What would you say to that?
I would say that for most people who graduate from college, they still keep a very strong connection to the colleges that they attended. Mm-hmm. I don't believe that this is any added incentive. And particularly, I believe, we have to balance out the equities here. And we know that the college that you go to will lead to higher opportunities for employment,
right.
Higher income at those particular jobs or careers. We know that there is also a connection to where you'll live, the type of health care that you'll receive. And so I'll say to those individuals that we have to think bigger because the ramifications are much more stronger than the incentives that you would need to stay connected to your university. Though I do suggest that you remain connected to your university.
Okay, Eric, I'll come back to you with regard to your resume. One of the things that your resume mentioned was this idea of ending early decisions in terms of the college admissions process, because sometimes you'll have students who won't go for the early admission because it's going to make it difficult for them to apply to other colleges that may actually give them better financial packages. What's your take on that?
Well, I think the Assembly bill was amended to right. take that out, but originally we did have the early action piece in the resolution because exactly as you said, if you're a student who really needs to wait to see what financial aid packages you get, you don't have the same flexibility as someone who's wealthier and doesn't need to decide based on what financial aid packages that they get. So that was something important that is in line, I think, with this idea was we should level the playing field for everybody.
Okay. And what's your take on the attack on affirmative action and to a point that it's now completely gutted with regard to Edward Bloom, using Asian Americans to sort of get into completely destroying what was essentially a remedy based to address discrimination for black folks, but somehow got transcended into as diversifying the college body.
Well, I think in your previous segment, you addressed that pretty well, but I just want to address how ridiculous it is to say that we shouldn't be targeting groups that need to be uplifted. CUNY does it all the time with great success. We have the CUNY Black Male Initiative, which says there's a gap in graduation rates of black men in CUNY. Okay. And so we invest in this program. Okay. There's a gap in the success rate of foster youth. So there's a particular program at CUNY for foster youth. We're seeing a rise in anti-Semitism on college campuses and CUNY campuses. So they invested money and created a Jewish advisory board to particularly address that community. So it's just, I think, common sense to say there's a need in a particular community. Let's invest in that and address that need.
Okay, fantastic. What some of the proposed policies that you think would be able to strengthen diversity efforts in terms of corporate America or even with just employers in general?
Well, I I'll say that I was a beneficiary of SUNY EOP. And it allowed me to go to college as a first-generation college student. And I think when we invest in programs like that, we will continue to sort of provide more people access to the pool of applicants for universities, and also then the pool of applicants for the career and job opportunities. Once we're able to do that, then we need to do more diversity job hiring. There should be more community-based job training, job hiring initiatives, where the trainings are not just existing, but that there's also a job at the end of that tunnel, because a lot of times in our communities, there's a lot of training, and people become sort of despondent to it because there's no job at the end of it. And so I believe that we need to do a more targeted approach, and that we need to put our money where our mouth is, both in the city and the state and the federal government, in order to fund the programs that we stand behind, which allows for more diversity, it allows for more access, and it allows for more opportunities.
Okay. Well, that was a great discussion. So while banning legacy admissions gets us closer to equity in the college admissions process, we still have a lot of work ahead of us, given the fact that we are headed in the wrong direction. The Supreme Court's decision requiring colleges and universities to use a race-neutral admissions process will no doubt have a severe negative impact on the enrollment of Black and Latinx students in elite higher education institutions for years to come. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, I'll be joined by Mike Gilliam to share some exciting news. I'm Kiiru Gichuru, and this is Let It Rip. I'd like to give our viewers an update regarding Let It Rip. Now, for the last 7 years, Mike Gilliam has hosted Let It Rip, but is now moving on to host a new show, still on CUNY TV, called A Slice of New York with Mike Gilliam. Mike, I wanted to take a look back on your 7 fantastic seasons on Let It Rip, while working closely with the phenomenal producer Tyreek Washington, who curated all the programming. Now, here's some spectacular moments from your time here at Let It Rip.
Hi, I'm Mike Gilliam, and the show is Let It Rip. We're coming to you from New York City with a viewpoint that goes beyond the headlines. We're talking politics, the economy, social unrest, the things that matter most to you.
Norman, is that impeachable behavior?
I believe so.
Okay, what do you think, Professor? Is it impeachable?
I totally agree.
Do you think that there's some sort of inherent problem with police dealing with people of color?
I think it's even much bigger than race right now, in my opinion.
Do we have too many men making the decisions?
I think that we have people making decisions for experiences that they have no insight into at all.
Now, you're studying cyber stalking, and you have stories that happened to you, right?
Right, yeah. I was cyberstalked when I was in college for a few years.
Where are we with these immigration policies?
If ICE comes knocking on your door, you have rights.
Yes.
Leveling the playing field for students.
Students in ASAP do not pay tuition at all. So that's a good program. We're trying to expand it and make it even better.
Come join us for the conversation.
That's taking me back. Oh, man.
That was pretty amazing, Mike. What would you say was some of your favorite moments with Let It Rip?
Oh, I enjoyed them all, but I have to tell you that one of the reasons I went into journalism was that I wanted to give voice to the little guy, the guy whose voice wasn't heard out there. And I think that's something that we strive to do with Let It Rip. You notice from the various topics that we covered there that a lot of those were not things that would be given like a half an hour on your evening news program, but we would do that on Let It Rip. So we covered a lot of different topics. We really dealt and leaned into things like police brutality and the problems with law enforcement in our communities. We dealt a lot with a woman's right to choose, things like that. All of those things meant a lot to me, and we hope that they meant a lot to our audience as well.
Well, I'm sure they did, because some of the topics that you guys covered were really pertinent to the times and, in fact, the moments that they were happening. So I'm hoping you tell us a little bit more about the new show, A Slice of New York with Mike Gilliam, and some of the things that you'll be doing there.
Okay, it's going to be a lot different than that show. Okay,
believe that.
Yeah, and the reason for that is I wanted to continue to give people voice, but to make it a little bit more intimate.
Okay.
Okay, and also to come up with things that you might not know about, but that you could kind of walk away from and say, that was good, you know, give you a little bit better feeling than that daily grind of politics and news that we're kind of getting right now. Not to say that we shouldn't be covering those things because they're very, very important, but I think there are times when you kind of need a little break.
Right. Now, just to let you know that we'll certainly miss you here at Let It Rip. And with Mike transitioning, I'm excited to announce that I will be the new host of Let It Rip, and I am looking forward to stepping into this new role and continuing to bring great progressive programming while working alongside the super talented producer, Tyreek Washington. Stay tuned, more to come. I'm Kiiru Gichuru, and this is Let It Rip.